15th of November, 1965, 1437, ICT, Ia Drang Valley, Pleiku Province. Specialist 4th class Ronald Baker kneels in elephant grass, taller than his head, with 11 morphine syrettes left in his M5 aid bag, and 14 men screaming around him. He counts tourniquets, 4 cloth strips, 2 already improvised from triangular bandages, and realizes the arithmetic will not close. The snap of a morphine syrette cap becomes the sound of choosing who lives and who dies in pain. The myth says medics in Vietnam saved who they could and left triage decisions to doctors in the rear. But on a bad day, a single platoon medic carried responsibility for 30 to 40 riflemen with exactly 12 morphine syrettes, 6 tourniquets, and no guarantee of Dustoff extraction inside 15 minutes. When casualties exceeded supplies, the medic became an accountant of blood. The real outcome of the firefight was decided not by rifles, but by his subtraction under fire. The doctrine said, save the salvageable, stabilize the delayed, comfort the expectant. The reality said, choose who screams and who doesn't. A United States Army infantry company in 1965 through 1971 fields 1 platoon medic for every 30 to 40 riflemen, and he steps off the helicopter with an M5 aid bag holding 12 morphine syrettes, 4 to 6 tourniquets, 10 field dressings, and 3 to 4 plasma expanders. The bag weighs 5 pounds when full. It weighs nothing when empty, but the medic carries it for the rest of his life anyway. Triage doctrine divides casualties into 3 categories: immediate, bleeding out, airways compromised, needs work now, delayed, stable but in pain, can wait 30 minutes, and expectant, so far gone that spending time on them kills someone salvageable. The medic learns expectant is a polite word for dying. The manual does not explain how to look a 19-year-old rifleman in the eyes and mentally classify him as expectant while he begs for help. The average platoon-level contact in I Corps or the Central Highlands generates 2 to 3 casualties. A bad ambush or bunker assault produces 6 to 10 inside the first 90 seconds. The worst contacts produce numbers that exceed everything the medic trained for at Fort Sam Houston. Dustoff doctrine promises a 10 to 15-minute window from radio call to patient loaded, but landing zone preparation, enemy fire, weather, and distance stretch real waits to 40 minutes or longer. Sometimes the wait is 2 hours. Sometimes the helicopter never comes at all. The morphine syrette holds 16 milligrams of morphine tartrate in a single-use tube with a wire loop seal. The medic snaps the wire loop, breaks the seal, and injects. The process takes 3 seconds. Once the cap snaps, the choice is made and cannot be unmade. If he runs out before the shooting stops, the men still screaming get nothing but a hand on the shoulder and a lie about the helicopter coming soon. 15th of November, 1965, 1437 ICT, Ia Drang Valley, Pleiku Province, Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, walks into a horseshoe ambush 400 meters northwest of landing zone X-ray. SP4 Ronald Baker hears the first RPD machine gun bursts and drops flat as 14 men go down in the initial volley. The grass is chest high, and the enemy is invisible. He crawls forward through grass that blocks his vision while 7.62 millimeter rounds snap overhead at 715 meters per second. The first man he reaches has no femoral pulse and a sucking chest wound that bubbles with every exhale. Baker mentally marks him expectant and moves on without wasting supplies. He does not look at the man's face. The second casualty has a through-and-through wound in the thigh, with arterial spray painting the grass red. Baker applies a tourniquet from his bag, twists the windlass until the bleeding stops, and snaps a morphine syrette into the man's deltoid muscle. He counts silently. 11 syrettes left, 13 men still screaming. The third casualty has taken shrapnel to the abdomen and is holding his intestines with both hands. The loops of bowel are gray and covered in dirt. Baker slaps a field dressing over the evisceration, gives him morphine, and tells him Dustoff is 10 minutes out. Baker knows the real weight will be closer to 40. He moves before the man can ask questions. He crawls to the fourth man, whose lower leg is attached by skin and nothing else. The tibia protrudes at a 90-degree angle, and the foot points backward. The man is coherent, begging, and Baker realizes he can save him if he uses 2 tourniquets and 2 syrettes now. But that leaves 9 syrettes for 10 other casualties, and he has not yet reached the one screaming loudest. He makes the call, 1 tourniquet above the knee, 1 syrette, and a promise he knows he cannot keep. The man stops screaming and starts crying instead. The 5th casualty is unconscious with a depressed skull fracture and agonal breathing. Baker checks for a pulse, finds one that is faint and irregular, and moves past him without stopping. There's nothing he can do. By the time he reaches the 7th man, he has 6 syrettes remaining and 7 men still bleeding. The math does not work. The 8th casualty has a shattered shoulder and is screaming for his mother. The words are clear and desperate. Baker has no morphine to give him, so he kneels beside the man, holds his hand, and lies about the helicopter inbound. He stays for 30 seconds, and then crawls toward the next voice. The man keeps screaming his name as Baker moves away. SP4 Ronald Doc Baker, platoon medic with Bravo Company, 1st of the 7th Cavalry, 15th of November, 1965. I ran out of morphine before I ran out of wounded. I had to choose who got it and who didn't. That's not medicine. That's math. The Dustoff UH-1D lands at 15:15 ICT, 38 minutes after the first radio call. Baker loads 9 men onto the skids and cabin floor. 5 are already dead. 3 die before the helicopter reaches the surgical hospital at Khe. The man with the shattered shoulder survives. He writes Baker a letter 6 months later. Baker never opens it. Not heroism, but subtraction. 31st of January, 1968, 03:15 ICT, Hue, Thua Tien Province, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Sergeant Tran Van Hoang runs through the shattered gates of the citadel as People's Army of Vietnam sappers detonate satchel charges inside the 1st Division headquarters compound. The sky glows orange from fires burning in 3 districts. He carries an ARVN issue aid bag with 8 morphine syrettes, 5 tourniquets, and 12 bandages for a company now scattered across 4 city blocks under small arms and rocket fire. The first casualty he finds is a lieutenant with both legs shredded below the knee by a Chinese Type 67 stick grenade. Both femoral arteries are pumping blood onto the cobblestones. Huang applies 2 tourniquets high on both thighs and injects morphine into the officer's arm. He realizes immediately. 6 syrettes remaining for what sounds like 20 wounded men screaming in the dark streets. The voices echo off the walls and make it impossible to count how many there are. He moves toward the loudest voices and finds 3 men in a courtyard lit by fires. One has a head wound with no pulse and his eyes are fixed and dilated. One has a shattered pelvis and is screaming words Huang cannot understand through the pain. One has a through-and-through shoulder wound and sits upright against a wall, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands and watching the other 2. Huang gives the shoulder wound a pressure bandage and no morphine. The man nods and keeps smoking. The pelvic fracture receives morphine and a lie about the ambulance coming from the May CV compound. Huang knows no American vehicles will reach the citadel until the PAV and sappers are cleared, and that will take hours or days. The man stops screaming and lies still. Huang does not know if he is unconscious or dead. He moves to the next block and finds 2 riflemen pinned under masonry rubble from a collapsed wall. The building took a direct hit from a recoilless rifle round. One has a crushed chest and coughs blood with every breath. The other has a compound femur fracture with bone protruding and is fully conscious, begging in a hoarse whisper. Huang pulls the conscious man free, splints the fractured leg with an M1 carbine and 2 triangular bandages, and injects morphine. The man with the crushed chest dies while Huang is working 3 meters away. He hears the breathing stop. By 0400 ICT, Huang has 2 syrettes left and 11 wounded men scattered across the citadel with no way to evacuate them until dawn. The radio is dead and the Pavn holds the streets between his position and the May CV compound. He finds a radio man with a shrapnel wound to the lower abdomen and hands him a syrette, telling him to self-inject if the pain becomes unbearable. The radio man injects it within 30 seconds. Huang wants to tell him to wait, but says nothing. Huang has 1 syrette remaining when he finds a sergeant with both hands severed at the wrists by a command-detonated mine, screaming and thrashing on the ground. The stumps are bleeding but not spurting. The man will not die from blood loss, but he will die from shock or infection within hours. Huang snaps the morphine cap, the sound echoing in the narrow street, and injects the last dose. He sits with the sergeant until the screaming stops and the man's breathing slows. He stays with him for 20 minutes, when he finally stands up to move to the next casualty. He has nothing left to give anyone. RVN Sergeant Tran Van Hoang, platoon medic with the 1st ARVN Division, 2nd of February 1968. I gave the last syrette to a man who would die anyway, because I could not let him die screaming. That meant another man spent the night in pain. I chose the dead over the living. The ARVN counterattack reaches the citadel at 0630 ICT on the 2nd of February. Huang evacuates 7 men to the MyCV advisory compound. 4 have been waiting in agony for 3 hours with no morphine. One of them dies during the evacuation. Not mercy, but rationing. 11th of May, 1969, 11:20 ICT, Joy 937, Hamburger Hill, Assau Valley, Thua Thien Province. Specialist 4. David Ray crouches behind a fallen mahogany log as Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, 187th Infantry, takes fire from North Vietnamese Army bunkers 60 meters upslope. This is the 9th assault on the hill in 4 days. He counts 8 men down in the first 40 seconds of contact and realizes his aid bag holds 10 morphine syrettes and 5 tourniquets for a platoon that just lost 1/4 of its effective strength. The bag was resupplied this morning, but it is already insufficient. Ray crawls to the nearest casualty, a rifleman with a penetrating chest wound and paradoxical chest movement. He seals the wound with plastic wrap from a C-ration pound cake bag, tapes it on 3 sides to create a flutter valve, and injects morphine. The man's breathing stabilizes slightly. The second man has a shattered femur with bone fragments protruding through torn trousers. Ray applies a tourniquet above the fracture, splints the leg with an entrenching tool and cravats, and gives him morphine. He has 8 syrettes remaining and 6 men screaming. The third casualty is unconscious with a depressed skull fracture and fixed dilated pupils. Ray checks for a carotid pulse, finds none, and moves past the body without hesitation. He has learned not to hesitate. The fourth man has taken a 7.62 millimeter round through the lower abdomen and is applying pressure to his own wound with a field dressing. Blood seeps through his fingers, but the flow is not arterial. Ray reinforces the bandage with medical tape, tells the man he is doing great, and deliberately saves the morphine for someone who cannot function. The fifth casualty has lost his right forearm below the elbow to a B-40 rocket fragment. The radius and ulna are visible. Ray applies a tourniquet, injects morphine into the left arm, and moves to the sixth man with shrapnel wounds to both legs. The bleeding is venous, not arterial. Ray bandages both wounds tightly and tells the man Dustoff is inbound. He does not give him morphine. The man asks why not. Ray does not answer. The seventh casualty is screaming with a shattered mandible and cannot form intelligible words. Ray injects morphine and crawls toward the eighth man, who has a through-and-through shoulder wound and sits upright, applying pressure himself. Ray has 5 syrettes left when the ninth man goes down 10 meters to his right, hit by rocket shrapnel that opens his abdomen from sternum to pelvis. Ray crawls to him, evaluates the massive evisceration and hemorrhage, and realizes the man will not survive the next 30 minutes, even with immediate surgical intervention. The intestines are shredded and the liver is lacerated. Ray does not give him morphine. Instead, he holds the man's hand and talks to him quietly about home. The casualty dies in 4 minutes. Ray stays with him for all 4. SP4 David Doc Ray, platoon medic with Bravo Company, 3rd of the 187th Infantry, 11th of May, 1969. I saved morphine by letting a guy die without it. That's the trade. You make it every time the bag runs low. The Dustoff UH-1H extracts 6 men at 12:05 ICT. Ray still has 3 syrettes in his bag. The company takes the hill at 1600 hours. Ray will use all 3 remaining syrettes before dark. Not abandonment, but allocation. The morphine syrette cap snaps, and the medic's hand moves to the next casualty. Every syrette he uses is one he cannot give to the next wounded man. Every casualty he stabilizes is time stolen from another soldier bleeding out 10 meters away. Every choice is a subtraction. The supplies never match the screaming. They never will. 21st of January, 1968, 05:30 ICT, Khe Sanh Combat Base, Quang Tri Province, the People's Army of Vietnam. 304th Division opens the siege with over 1,000 artillery and mortar rounds impacting inside the perimeter in the first 90 minutes. The base medical bunker receives dozens of casualties before 0700 ICT. And the triage line extends 20 meters into the trench outside under continued incoming fire. Rounds impact every 30 seconds. The 2 Navy surgeons and 4 corpsmen divide the wounded into 3 groups using the categories drilled into them at Field Medical Service School. 19 immediate cases requiring operating table intervention now. 14 delayed cases who can wait 30 minutes for treatment, and 14 expectant cases who will die regardless of medical intervention. The expectant casualties are moved to a side bunker separated by sandbags and given morphine if the rapidly depleting supplies allow. The morphine runs out faster than anyone predicted. By 0800 ICT, the morphine stock is exhausted entirely. The last 6 expectant cases receive no pain relief beyond verbal reassurance that means nothing. A corpsman holds each man's hand in turn. One man dies screaming words no one can understand. The others die quietly over the next 2 hours, and the medical staff will debate for decades whether the quiet deaths were resignation or shock-induced unconsciousness, or simply the body shutting down without complaint. The doctors know with certainty they made the correct triage call. 19 men survive because morphine and surgical time were concentrated on salvageable casualties. But the sound of the one screaming man follows the senior surgeon for 40 years. He will hear it in quiet moments for the rest of his life. First Lieutenant Patrick Brady, Dustoff pilot with the 54th Medical Detachment, 1967 through 68. We flew into fire because the medics told us the guy would die without us, but sometimes we got there and found out the medic had already triaged him expectant. The call was always right, but it was never easy. At Fire Base Mary Ann, Quang Tin Province, on the 28th of March, 1971, 0230 ICT, a People's Army sapper assault kills over 30 Americans in the first 15 minutes of contact. Bangalore torpedoes breach the wire in 6 places simultaneously. The base medic runs from bunker to bunker with 9 syrettes and 4 tourniquets for 40 casualties scattered across the firebase perimeter. He spends 20 minutes stabilizing a staff sergeant with a shattered pelvis and massive blood loss, applying pressure, starting an intravenous line with shaking hands, and preparing him for Dustoff extraction. While the medic works on the sergeant, 3 other men bleed out in adjacent bunkers, alone in the dark. The sergeant survives and is evacuated to the 71st Evacuation Hospital in Pleiku. The other 3 do not. The medic writes in his after-action statement that he made the correct triage decision based on assessed survivability, but he does not sleep for 72 hours afterward and requests a psychiatric evaluation 2 weeks later. The evaluation recommends a 30-day rest period. He refuses and returns to duty after 1 week. In Cholon District, Saigon-Gia-Jin, on the 3rd of March 1968, 1645 ICT, an ARVN medic treats 12 civilians caught in crossfire between ARVN Rangers and Viet Cong holdouts, barricaded in a textile factory. He has 6 morphine syrettes and 8 field dressings for 12 people, including 3 children under the age of 10. He gives morphine to a woman with a sucking chest wound, a man with a shattered femur, and a 7-year-old child with abdominal shrapnel and signs of internal hemorrhage. The child's abdomen is distended and rigid. He does not give morphine to 2 elderly men with expectant penetrating torso wounds or to a 16-year-old boy with a through-and-through thigh wound who is hemodynamically stable. The teenage boy survives and is evacuated to Grawl Hospital. Both elderly men die in pain on the street. One takes 14 minutes to die. The medic kneels beside him for the entire time, but has nothing to give him except presence. Bak Si Le Ti Lan, NLF Field Surgeon, 1969. In the tunnel hospitals, we had almost no morphine. We operated with rice wine and willpower. Your medics had the luxury of choosing who suffered. We had no choice. The medic's arithmetic is always identical. Subtract the dying, stabilize the salvageable, and ration pain relief until the supplies or the casualties run out, whichever comes first. The equation never changes. The men who make these decisions carry them forever, not because they were wrong, but because they were necessary. After the war ends in 1975, the United States Army Medical Department revises triage doctrine to emphasize psychological support protocols for combat medics who must make expectant category decisions under fire. By the late 1970s, revisions to Field Manual 810 explicitly acknowledge that the expectant classification is not a medical failure, but an operational necessity when supplies, time, and personnel are finite resources. The revision includes a new chapter on moral injury and decision-making under extreme stress. Field medic training at Fort Sam Houston in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s incorporates role-playing scenarios where students must choose between 2 simulated casualties with deliberately limited supplies. The training scenarios are designed to replicate the Ia Drang arithmetic. Not enough morphine, not enough tourniquets, not enough hands, and no time to save everyone. Students fail the scenarios repeatedly until they learn that failure is built into the structure. Some students request transfers to other specialties. Most do not. Veterans who served as combat medics in Vietnam report statistically higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury diagnoses than infantry riflemen in the same units, and the Department of Veterans Affairs recognizes triage guilt as a distinct trauma category by the early 1980s. The recognition comes too late for some. Veterans groups estimate that hundreds of combat medics took their own lives in the decade after the war ended, though the exact number is unknown because the VA did not track the data until the mid-80s. Captain Robert Doc O'Neill, Australian medical advisor with the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, 1969. The blokes I couldn't save didn't haunt me because I failed. They haunted me because I chose not to try. The morphine syrette remained standard issue in United States military aid bags until 2007, when it is replaced by auto-injector systems with improved dosage control and shelf stability. The replacement does not solve the underlying problem. When casualties exceed supplies, someone must choose who receives pain relief and who does not? Some medics here are composites built from multiple after-action reports and interviews, but the triage math is real. The men who made those choices in Vietnam carry the weight of subtraction, not heroism, not failure, but the arithmetic of survival when the numbers do not close. When supplies run out, seconds become the only medicine left. The morphine cap snaps, the tourniquet twists, the medic moves to the next man. Every choice saves one life by spending another. The war ends, but the counting never stops. The medics who made these decisions still count in their sleep. They count syrettes, they count tourniquets, they count the men who lived and the men who died, and the men who died screaming because there was nothing left to give them. The arithmetic never balances. It never will.